Hi, everybody. So as Anna said, I spoke to some of the people in this group, but for anybody I didn't speak to back in March. What I have started coming up with is a framework on how do you go about changing consumption, because we keep seeing this conversation around like, you can't consume this much. But in reality, if you work in the marketing industry, which I do and a lot of you do, to turn around to anybody and go, well, I just don't think we should do consumption anymore, doesn't really give you anywhere to go as a professional conversation. There needs to be okay, what do new types of consumption look like then, and then how do we get there? We need a plan, we need a framework. So what I talked about in the last session was kind of the thinking I'd got to at that point, which was, in order to change consumption, you need to shift what people consume. So from meat to plant-based foods, as an example. You need to shift how people consume. So that's about things like changing business models. So rather than selling an item once, you need to be selling it repeatedly. So that's things like refill models, the sharing economy, rental economy, and so on. And you need to share what happens after we consume, which is all of the circular economy stuff. So how do you do behavior change, for instance, within marketing, to get people to actually reduce how much product they use, or to recycle, or to reuse, or resell, or repair. And it was hard work pulling that together, but it's quite practical, and it's based on, you need to change product, business model, and skill set within our industry. So our current skill set is primarily around building fame and desire. We need to build much more experience design into that. For instance, like refill business models are never going to work without experience design being a much more broadly adopted skill. At the minute, it's something that still kind of sits in pockets, I would say, within our industry. And then my point of view at that point was, and all of that should be underpinned by changing why we consume. And then I kind of went, I've just got no idea how you do that. That's my next thing. And I've left it till last because it's the hardest, and like, Christ knows where you start. But I've had a go at it since then and kind of pulled together a point of view. And so what I'm going to share today is what my point of view is on how we change why people consume, and also a little bit about how I got to that point of view. Because when I first started doing it, it was just a sprawling mess in my head, because it is such a big conversation and it involves every single facet of society. And so I had to really rein myself in and go, right, realistically, if what I'm trying to create is a practical toolkit, I have to build something that is useful and actionable by people working within marketing agencies. So if I'm creating this for somebody I work with, it needs to be something where they can actually take an action based on it. So I've really tried to focusing on what is the role of brands in changing why we consume. So what I haven't included is, what's the role of social policy in changing why we consume? That doesn't mean that isn't an enormously huge part of it. It's not where my expertise lies, and it's not an area where I have the ability to create change. And so that's not where I focused for this. So I started out by kind of going, right, so the first question then is why do people currently consume? And I know there are lots and lots of reasons, but I kind of went with desire is mimetic. For the most part in advertising, we build desire through mimetic devices. People want to be like other people. In particular in the Western world, we consume because it says something about who we are. We are way past the point of only consuming because we need certain things. Our Maslow's hierarchy of needs is entirely fucked up, and we're all saying that we need X, Y, and Z when quite frankly we don't. So I then kind of went, right, so if mimetic desire is what's driving us to consume too much, then what are the ways in which we could take advantage of that mimetic desire to change why people consume? And came up with there are probably 3 ways in which we can change why people consume through brands and advertising and marketing, and then a couple of other things that are kind of considerations for brands as well. So the 3 things I got to were we need to create new stories. So our job is, if we're doing good advertising, is to create stories, is to involve people in new worlds. So we need to create new stories. And they need to be ones that visualize and promote a future where humans and nature thrive, where society is equitable, and we live in a way that benefits and respects the planet that we live on and the other people who live on the planet. So storytelling was one of the main things. And I referenced, I wrote a longhand article on this, which I'll share in the chat when I'm finished talking. So you can read you don't have to take loads of notes, you can just read whatever in. And so I referenced there a few examples of where we have previously shown that we have the ability to come up with stories that change culture. So things like P&G investing in soap operas. Soap operas have been an enormous part of culture and have regularly proven themselves to be a way of changing what people believe to be okay and normal and part of mass conversation. I also name people like Dove. So the Real Beauty creative work, that whole story around self-esteem has massively changed the conversation and culture around female beauty and how we look at ourselves and our bodies. And even people like Red Bull, their investment in telling the story of extreme sports has seen that side of culture in society grow enormously. And that's because they've helped tell their story and bring it to life in really interesting ways and to much larger audiences than they've seen before. So stories is one thing. The next thing is symbols. So how can media and advertising and marketing popularize new symbols? And that means new symbols of success and meaning, and potentially even symbols that help to disconnect stuff and productivity from success. So that's starting to lean a little bit into like trying to redefine success. That one was quite a big area because in my head I was like, that could be anything. A symbol could be anything from everybody carrying a reusable water bottle around with them. That is a symbol of a different way of living that we've made famous through advertising. And Chili's has done an amazing job of using the power of design to make that desirable, not just a practical thing. But what I thought was really interesting about symbols is the idea of who do we see as symbols of success in this new world, not just what. And that's where things like how do you ensure that Indigenous communities are involved much more in advertising when we're telling our stories? Instead of having a fast fashion influencer be the face of a piece of communications, why aren't we talking to the people who are already doing the good work? So symbols for me is not just about a physical symbol like a watch. It's about the who are the symbols that we see as impressive and aspirational and interesting, and what's our role in advertising in making those people feel more aspirational to the broader public out there. So stories and symbols too. The last one, I lean very heavily on the work of John Alexander and his citizenship work. And so the final one is, within marketing, we need to be treating people as whole people. So as citizens who have multiple facets. Consumption and being a consumer is just one part of being a consumer. Oh my God, it's just baked into my head. It's just one part of being a human nowadays. So what is the role for brands in treating people as citizens, not just consumers? So we are still consumers. So a marketer should still be looking and going, who is my target audience? Where's my source of growth? Who is going to consume my product? And therefore, who should I sell to? But we should be also saying things like, as a marketer, I don't know how to solve the problem of plastic waste. So I would like to bring in some of my core customers, some experts in plastic waste, and let's work together to come up with product innovations that actually solve problems rather than me just selling my current solution. So how do you start to bring your audience into the work that we're doing? And I think that also leans into a lot of other trends. So when you look at things like Web 3.0 and the sharing economy, all of those things lean much more on treating consumers as co-creators and influencers in and of themselves. So I think that's part of a much bigger trend, if I'm honest. But like I say, I lean very heavily on John's work. So if anybody hasn't read his book, I would highly recommend it. So that was kind of in order to change why we consume, those are the three things that brands can have some influence over. But then there are two other things that are really important to consider as well. So one is product. If you want to change why we consume, I think brands also need to be changing their products so that they create products as though the laws already existed to stop them from making bad products. And the reason I've put that in this why column rather than any of the others is because I think in order for the why, how do we change why people consume model to work, you have to set it against a background of government legislation and policy, because there's no point just changing culture. You need to change the structure at the same time. And so I kind of included a bit of product point there as well. And I think I wanted to be really clear in this piece that what I'm not saying is brands have the ability to change the world. It's on you. Go for it with some advertising. Brands do have an enormous influence, but without government legislation and policy change and structural change, there is only so far that brand-led cultural change is going to get you. So I kind of wanted to not make it a warning, but just balance it a little bit by going like, you know, brands do have an enormous role, but it's you need government as well. So that's kind of so where I've kind of got in my head, I'll show with my fingers in this model is kind of we need to change consumption, and there are 3 ways in which we do that. We change the what, we change the how, we change the after. Underpinning that is changing why we consume. And then those boxes sit against a background, which is government legislation and policy change that enables and forces a bit of speed against those other 4 areas. That's kind of where I've got to. Like I say, I'll share the longhand article I've wrote, kind of going through my thinking. But yeah, just be interesting to know if like I'm you know, when you've been in something a bit too much, you can't always entirely judge, like, is this useful? Is it practical? Do other people look at it and go, still not actually very useful, I don't know what I do with that, in which case I've totally failed. Or is it something that people can look at and go, actually, I can see how having a simplified framework of a lot of thinking that's actually already out there, all I'm doing really is pulling this together into something and trying to simplify it. Because, and the reason, and I said this in the last meeting, I think simplification is really important, but also as somebody who works in an agency and deals with lots of agency people and marketing people, client side, we speak in PowerPoint. That's how we communicate. So I'm trying to go, how do you take all this stuff that's out there and present it as a PowerPoint slide? Because if it's in a PowerPoint slide and it's copyable and it's stealable, people will share it and use it. So a very, very practical level. I was also kind of going, how do I make something that's just really easy to rip off and reuse in PowerPoint? Which I never thought I'd set myself as a brief. But there's no point fighting it. There are better ways to communicate, but we use PowerPoint, so, or Keynote, but you know, same. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. Any feedback is always appreciated, and yeah, just be great to know what people think.